Our guests this evening are Longmont composer Michael Udow. He'll be describing for you the development of his latest opera, Aurora II, and we'll be sharing with you some clips of recordings of musical excerpts from Aurora II. This opera is based on the Holocaust survival story of sisters Henia and Ilona Karmel. Joy Ensor, the daughter and niece of Henia and Ilona, will be describing and reading from the anthology, The Ones Who Remember, Second Generation Voices of the Holocaust, of which she is co-editor and contributing author. Would you please welcome with me Michael Udow and Joy Ensor.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'd like to share some background about today's presentation. My mother and aunt, Henia and Ilona Karmel, grew up in Krakow, Poland. Their family had come to Krakow in 1492 to escape the Spanish Inquisition, part of a great migration that led Poland to be the center of Jewish life in Europe for hundreds of years. In the era between the two world wars, Krakow was home to a thriving Jewish culture with a lively literary and artistic scene in many languages, Polish, Hebrew, and Yiddish. Henia and Ilona were educated in the progressive Krakow Hebrew Gymnasium, a baccalaureate school. Their futures were full of possibility. And then came the war. We'll hear more about that in this presentation, including the remarkable fact that in the concentration camps, they wrote poetry. After the war, my parents and aunt spent 2 years in Sweden, where my older brother was born. They immigrated to the US in the late 1940s, sponsored by their Uncle Gershom and Aunt Mary, whose own immigration story just a few years earlier is an amazing saga of its own. And two of Gershom and Mary's granddaughters, Brenda Alberico and Joyce Perella, are with us here tonight. Henia and Ilona went on to have literary careers in English in this country, publishing numerous short stories and 2 novels apiece. Fast forward to 1982. My husband Doug, who's in the back, and I were new parents living in our little starter house on Creel Crescent in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And a lovely couple, Mike and Nancy Udow, moved in next door. Nancy was a dancer and yoga instructor, and Mike was a professor, percussionist, and composer at the University of Michigan School of Music. They had spent a year in Poland on a Fulbright fellowship and had an enduring interest in Polish language and culture. Mike and Nancy's daughter, Rachel, and our younger daughter, Hannah, became best of friends, collaborating as Hiru, H-E-R-U, for Henia Ensor and Rachel Udow, in countless adventures and creative projects. Together with our across-the-street neighbors, Max and Sandy Bromley, we called ourselves the Creel Associates, a set of friendships that's endured to this day, despite our all moving away from the old neighborhood and our losing Max just last year. Fast forward again to 2004, when a group of adult children of Holocaust survivors in my Ann Arbor synagogue came together as a group that was called Generations After. We had taken on the challenge to write original Holocaust remembrance services for our congregation, services in which we centered the stories of our parents to honor the rich lives they had led before the war, the losses they had suffered during the war, and the resilience they'd shown in creating new lives afterward. About 10 years into writing these services, we decided to pull these narratives together into an anthology. Because, how hard could that be? As the project progressed, we accepted the advice from some of our readers to shift our focus to our own lived experiences growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust. And last April, our book, The Ones Who Remember, Second Generation Voices of the Holocaust was published. Mike and Nancy retired to Longmont in 2011, lucky you. And in 2015, Doug and I were vacationing in Silverthorne at the summer home of Judy and Peter Kleinman, who are also here today. And while we were there, Mike and Nancy came for an overnight visit. Mike had recently finished reading A Wall of Two, the English translation of Henia and Ilona's wartime poems, and out of the blue he said, I'm going to write an opera about the Karmel sisters. To which I said, really? You might want to sleep on that. And he took a nap. And he, as he often does, and he got up and he declared, I'm going to write an opera about the sisters. And now, here we are, with this opera and this book. Music and storytelling are quite probably hardwired into us humans as a way to celebrate, to mourn, and to create meaning of our experiences. In this presentation, we're going to interweave excerpts from Mike's opera with excerpts from my chapter in our book, and we'll also, bonus, include some recently rediscovered clips from a radio interview that my mother Henia did in 1984, following the publication of her second novel. We're so thrilled and honored to share our work with you today. Next, you'll hear an excerpt from my mother's radio interview.
What were your poems about? What were your emotions as you wrote them?
Oh, the poems were just gushing out, you know. I mean, it was an incredibly intense period of my life. If I tell you that, and crazy as it might sound, a very happy time in my life because of the creativity, and the poems were not about camps at all. it was my hiding place, you know. So you have a lot of love poems. You have poems remembering places. You have nature poems about flowers and spring and trees.
All this creativity sprung from within you, and was really to black out what was around you.
It was to black out. Also, this is something I'm extremely proud of, because can you imagine women who were reduced to nothing but their stomach? I mean, that all one could think about was, you know, food. And we arranged evenings of poetry, and to grasp attention of 1,000 people on the block and give them something that would make them human for a short while. When I visited Israel for the first time, I was walking down Dizengoff in Tel Aviv, and people would stop and somebody would throw arms around me and
recognize you.
And recognize me and thank me for the poem. And time and again it would happen. And only recently I got a letter from the girl. I mean, now she's a woman, but I mean, then she was a very young girl who was reciting the poems very beautifully. And she said she went to Yad Vashem, and she heard somebody asking whether they have the poems. And she listened, and they told the woman who was asking about it, they have the original. I have the original. I gave the original to Yad Vashem. Yeah. Left myself one piece of paper. This was a production sheet, and I stole it, and we wrote poems on it. Well, anyway, she made it her life's task. She memorized the poems, she wrote them down, and she made sure that they survived. That they would live. So I think that the poems had I hate the word mission, but they had a mission. They really fulfilled their mission.
And they fulfilled that mission.
Yeah. So I just have to mention that the radio interview was in April of 1984, and it aired in June of 1984, and 2 days after it aired, my mother had a fatal heart attack. And I heard the tape shortly after she died, and I really couldn't handle it, and never wanted to hear it again, and I heard it again for the first time 39 years later, yesterday. So I'm metabolizing a lot of energy in my body. If anybody knows of a good deep tissue massage therapist in town, I will take that recommendation. Mike does. Okay. So now I'm going to read the first excerpt from my chapter, which is about the backstory to these poems being written. In 1943, in the midst of the horror and degradation of the Skazhisko slave labor camp, my 22-year-old mother wrote a defiant line. My name is number 906, and guess what? I still write verse. Henia Karmel and her sister Ilona had already endured the terror of the Nazi invasion. Their family had fled Krakow for the east, but after their father was captured and deported to his death, they decided they were better off returning to the relative safety and community of the Krakow ghetto. From there, my mother, aunt, and grandmother were enslaved in Ploshchov, Skazhisko, and Buchenwald. Along with the other prisoners, they were starved and beaten. They fell ill with typhoid and typhus. They watched as loved ones were taken off to their deaths. Their survival depended on contributing to the German war effort. Working under horrific conditions, they stuffed munitions with poisonous picric acid that infiltrated their lungs and yellowed their skin. And yet, through all of this, Henia and Ilona wrote poetry on sheets of paper like that, smuggled into the barracks from the slave labor factory. In the progressive Jewish academy they attended until the outbreak of World War II, the sisters had studied Polish, learning Adam Mickiewicz's classical romantic verses and Julian Tuwim's experimental poetic forms. They loved Poland and her literature, even though, my mother lamented, Poland never loved them back. My mother gave birth to my brother in October 1946. He was named Johann Zvi, later anglicized to John Howard, for his two lost grandfathers. During his earliest weeks, my mother wrote him a series of letters in a small red leather-bound journal. They opened with this promise: I will tell you about all those you weren't given the opportunity to know and to love, all those who will live through you and those who will follow you, because I will create a legend to secure their immortality.
First there is a soul and a seed, swelling, secret, deep, a troubled premonition, dusk, germination. The seed is sharp, patient, spread into words, strophe, sound, branches. Then you're its gardener, its rhythm comes like a gale that sways in your soul. Your pen is your shovel, transplanting these words into ridges on paper, where they travel in air, tear off and disappear.
That was Donna Ray Lauren, mezzo-soprano, portraying Henia. During my college years, my mother was working on a story about her last spring in captivity. As the Passover holiday approached, it occurred to her that the Haggadah, a book that Jews the world over used to retell the story of how Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, could have been written about the ways in which Jews were currently oppressed. My mother organized a secret seder in her barrack, using slices of white sugar beet to stand in for matzah. Defying the prohibition on religious observances, she recited the Haggadah from memory, adapting the narrative from past tense Egypt to present tense Germany. My mother had never before talked about the Seder in the camp, but now that she was writing about it, she was determined to reenact it. She started scouring the local produce markets for a sugar beet to place on our Seder plate, arguing with Ilona, who insisted that it wasn't a sugar beet they had sliced to use in place of matzah, but rather kohlrabi.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Dearest loved ones, we gather to celebrate Pesach, remembering those of our flock who perished since the days of Pharaoh, while continuing to face the horrors of persecution. We are survivors. Blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness. This night is different from all other nights, as we eat only matzah, unleavened bread made in haste, while the Jewish slaves were fleeing Egypt. Shabachol Halilot Tanuglin She'ar Yirakot Halayla Hazeh Maror. On this night we eat bitter herbs to commemorate the bitterness of lives lived in bondage.
The mezzo-soprano who portrays Ilona is Gloria Palermo, and the voice soprano is?
Eddie Cortona, older youth choir.
So the sisters' wartime poems were privately published in New York in 1947. This is the original edition. They were still in Stockholm, and a group of survivors arranged for the publication. They were later republished in Poland, in Krakow, in 2015. And from Stockholm, Henia and Ilona wrote a preface to the edition that includes the following. It is difficult from the perspective of 2 years to contemplate the genesis of these poems. When we look at them right in front of us, the images come again. Inscriptions upon the walls of prisons and camps, scrawled at the last moment by people who had already died. Cries for help, calls for revenge, a sentence terminated at midpoint, maybe only a name and a date. The terror of those days marked clumsily by a weakening hand upon a hard, indifferent wall. Today, only half-readable traces remain. These poems are exactly that, inscriptions on a prison wall.
I should mention before this example, the music, that as most of you may know, the conductor of the ensemble is our own Elliot Moore, music director of the Longmont Symphony Orchestra. We're so lucky and fortunate to have him as our maestro in this city. And I also would like to thank University of Colorado School of Music, who allowed us to use their beautiful Grusin Hall for this recording.
Proxia dimitu, proxia, proxia, why did you write my name all over the walls? Is this pain written down, or resistance to life passing? Were you too afraid to disappear without a sound? No one to miss you because you belong to no one. circles the barracks. The air is heavy, foul, still. Across the exhausted bodies, sleep is restless but breathless. Someone springs up, another moans. Someone gets scared and breaks into tears. In the barracks, close to midnight, every night is torment. Stab after stab of dread bars each heart, and finally cracks the stone cold sleep of some, and they awake together to the horror. Look there, the door.
So this is my father, Leszek, with our older daughter, Sarah, on the left, and our younger daughter, Hannah, behind him, at a Passover Seder in Ann Arbor. At the time of my mother's hunt for sugar beet, I was more bemused by her excursions to the far corners of the Bronx in search of a random root vegetable than sensitive to her quest to honor a singular moment in her life in the camps. The essay she wrote was published a few years later, and when I read it, I realized that I was the same age she had been when those events took place. The contrast between her experience in the camp and my own life of relative ease as a psychology graduate student could not have been more stark. No matter how hard I tried, I could not imagine myself in my mother's place. But my mother's writing opened a door for me as it had for her. I realized that what I could do was scour my local markets for sugar beet to put on my own Seder table. Side note, they're hard to find in Ann Arbor as they were in New York City. We would have done better to live here in Longmont, where Mike tells me they were once a huge crop. To this day, I read my mother's story at our Seders. A new generation of our intentional family has grown up hearing it. It brings me great joy when my daughters and many of my honorary nieces and nephews choose to read my mother's Seder story at their own Passover tables in honor of her suffering and her courage.
Shortly after my mother was published, I was sent on a book tour that included Cleveland, where I faced my largest audience. A woman sitting in the front row, sensing my stage fright, looked at me reassuringly. When I finished my talk, she got up and turned to the audience while pointing at me. I know her, I was with her. Then looking back at me, she choked. Tell them about the Seder. Tell us, the audience chanted, and I did, the way I am telling it to you now. What I could not understand was why people cried. I still look back on that evening as one of the highlights of my life.
So on the left is my mother Henia holding her newborn grandson, my nephew Aaron, whose brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Mitch and Robin, are waving at you right now. And on the right is Ilona. Both pictures were taken in the mid-1970s. My mother and aunt were extremely close and also, to my eyes, completely different from one another. Ilona and her husband Hans Zucker were childless. Henia had 2 children. Ilona was the country mouse, living in a house in a leafy suburb of Boston and buying her clothes in second-hand stores. Henia was the city mouse, living in a rent-controlled apartment and fussing over her appearance, even though, she said, buying herself new clothes triggered nightmares about her mother standing starved and freezing in prison rags. Henia was the beauty, although Ilona had striking good looks, and Ilona was the brain, although Henia was highly intelligent. Henia kept an immaculate apartment and was an indifferent cook. Ilona's kitchen counters, much to my mother's horror, were a calamity of open cat food cans, overflowing ashtrays, and dirty pots and pans, but her cooking and baking were legendary. The sisters squabbled over books, over art, over whether the latest pope was an anti-Semite, but I do not recall their ever arguing or competing over their writing. They exchanged drafts of their manuscripts and took each other's critiques to heart. Their shorthand was that Henia was the better poet and Ilona the better novelist, but their support for each other never wavered.
Excuse me, sir, just a minute. Could you kindly tell me where I can find a human being? That's right, a normal one, in a suit or something, maybe double or single-breasted, no brass buttons, no uniforms, a person. Are they out of stock? Is this media for uniforms all we get? Is this today's fashion? What a shame! I thought maybe there would be one specimen left. Perhaps in the zoo in Berlin.
Those are my parents after they were reunited in September 1945. In the summer of 1944, my mother, aunt, and grandmother were among the 6,000 women of Skaržisko who were transported to the Hasak slave labor plant at Buchenwald. In April of 1945, as the war drew to a close, the Buchenwald inmates were gathered for a death march to elude the approaching American army. Determined to preserve the poems, my mother sewed the manuscript into the hem of her prison uniform. I imagine her huddled in her bunk in the darkness, green eyes flashing, the needle moving swiftly through the thin fabric of her dress, forming tight stitches with a skill that I always envied but could never match. So during the death march, a German tank deliberately ran over prisoners who were resting in a ditch. My mother, aunt, and grandmother were among them. They were left behind for dead. My grandmother did not survive this final assault. My mother and aunt lost a leg apiece, but survived. My parents had promised each other that should they both survive the war, they would return to Krakow and find each other. My father, after being liberated from a sub-camp of Gross Rosen, kept his word. At a newly established reunification center, he met my mother's cousin, who had been in the Buchenwald death march and had passed by the ditch after the accident. In her last act before losing consciousness, my mother had ripped the manuscript of poems out of her dress and handed it to this cousin, whose name is unfortunately lost to me, beseeching her to find my father and give it to him. The cousin had the manuscript in hand when she encountered my father. She told him that Henia, Ilona, and their mother had all been killed. By this time, my father was numbed by news of death, but he had the presence of mind to ask her whether the women were actually dead when she last saw them. They were close to death, the cousin said, and could not possibly have survived. My father decided that he had nothing left to lose by searching for the women until he confirmed his fate. His civil service job that gave him access to jeeps, vodka, and cigarettes, combined with the arrogant aim he had adopted during the war and maintained in post-war Poland, where anti-Semitic pogroms persisted, afforded him safe passage across the country. Word of the sisters' deaths had spread among the remnants of the Krakow Jewish community. Their poems had been part of an underground cultural life in the camps, and the survivors prevailed on my father to give them permission to hold a memorial program. My father, exhausted and heartbroken from his fruitless search, grudgingly acceded. He attended the service, standing at the back of a large cinema in Krakow, listening to the first post-war public reading of the sisters' poems. The next week, word reached my father that the sisters were alive in a hospital in Leipzig. Using vodka and cigarettes to bribe the border guards, he crossed into East Germany and brought Henia and Ilona home.
I and my sister were together. We went to a big hospital in Leipzig, and one evening, two men wearing Polish uniforms walked in, and I recognized one of them as a brother of my first boyfriend when I was 12.
Oh my goodness.
And they told us how they found out about us. They came on business, and once they told the people in Jewish community they were from Krakow. Somebody told them there are two girls from Krakow who are in the hospital all alone and very sick. Why don't you go and visit them? And they asked for our name. And when they heard the name, they said, this is impossible, they are not alive. Only yesterday, or days before yesterday, we attended a memorial service, and we stood 3 minutes silence in their honor. It was an evening of their poems were being read.
Isn't that incredible?
So I think that I am the only person alive who saw, I saw my own obituary.
Oh, isn't that? Oh.
Well, anyway, so when they asked me whether I want them to contact somebody, and I couldn't think of anybody. I did not put down my husband's name, because even if subconsciously I believed,
you were still afraid
I was
to hope.
still afraid to hope and jinx the possibility. Well, anyway, they promised they will come back. And they came back a few weeks later, and by then they knew that we were starving, almost like in camp, because there was no food. And they came and they brought food, and they brought, everything you can imagine. And I was holding to a roll. I remember it like as if this was yesterday, biting into a roll, and I said, now I can eat, and I'm not going to ask any questions. I will enjoy the food, and I don't want to know. I just don't want to know. And then one of them turned to me and said, what did you say when you got the letter from your husband? And I didn't get any letter. I said, I think I passed out. I don't remember, Anyhow, so the other one started, saying, why are you getting hysterical? I don't know how I reacted, because this whole thing is kind of a blank in my mind. Well, once I knew that he was alive. They said, do you want to write a letter? And all the poems that I wrote were to my husband. I was writing letters in my mind for 2.5 years, and I couldn't write a sentence. And I had a German book that I was reading, and the title of the book was Ich warte auf dich, I'm waiting for you.
Oh,
so I just cut the title and I said, out, and I gave it to one of the men. I said, give it. I still have it. And then they told me, my husband, it's very hard to get a permit because I was in East Germany and this was Poland. And that it will take a long time until he'll be able to come. And this was very hard for me, knowing that he's alive somewhere and not being able to get to you. To get to me. And then one day, late in the evening, a nurse came in and she said, "Are you well enough to have company?" And I said, "Why she asked me such a stupid question?" And I said, "What company?" There was a, curfew. Who would come after curfew? And in walked a young woman on whom Marta is based. I mean, it's not she, but I mean one of the characters in my book. It's based on her. With a dashing officer. And I looked at her, and she looked familiar, and I said, "Do I know you?" And she said, "No, but I know your husband. I bring you regard." And by then, I knew, and I said, "Let him come in." That was it.
What a story. What a story.
So this was the real story.
We had a wonderful recording engineer. His name is Kevin Harbison. He's a staff member at the University of Colorado. And also, for those of you who attend the Longmont Symphony concerts, you may notice a videographer who's constantly running around making sure all the cameras are on. And his name is Craig Stevens, and he did the video. This video is done on my camcorder, which is in the corner over here. But we'll be working on editing and mixing his 7 GoPros and 4 high-end cameras shoot of this opera, along with Kevin Harbison's beautiful recording. So this is past 2 days we've been working furiously since the last recording session ended at 7:30 on Sunday evening to put this together for you. But the finished product will even be greater icing on the cake, I think.
One night the sirens howl like hyenas, and the way they go on proves that the night is dead. Futile calls for help are swallowed by the dark. Now there's a big and a flash that seems to rush on a shriek. The length and depth of the sky, it penetrates the stars and clouds like a hideous claw that creeps loose. Investigates, eavesdrops, spies, and zigzags. Where's my enemy? Where's my enemy? Here, here, maybe here. You beast, grab it from throat to snout. Bite, bite into the mark. Your enemy's here. Ready, aim, fire. Maybe you'll hit your mark.
yahrzeit candle. Yahrzeit literally means year's time and refers to the anniversary of the death of a loved one. And we light it on that anniversary and it burns for 24 hours. There was barely enough room to hold all the memorial candles that my parents lit every Yizkor. The tiny galley kitchen in our New York City apartment was short of counter space, and the bookshelves were not flame-proof. So the candles were arrayed on a rolling Sultan hot table, tucked in the hallway outside my bedroom. There was a candle for each of my grandmothers, another 2 for my grandfathers, and 1 more for everyone else, including 9 of my father's 10 brothers and sisters and almost all of their offspring, the sweet children of the family. The candles flickered through the night, casting shadows that danced on the walls and ceiling just outside my bedroom door. Those flickers and shadows terrified me as a child. I dreaded having to cross their path to go from my room to the bathroom. I would hold off as long as I could, and then, covering my eyes and crouching low, skitter past the candles as quickly as I could, lest the ghosts in the flickers grab me. It never occurred to me to ask my parents to roll the hot table to a different location. I never told them I was frightened. I knew from my father's burning eyes and my mother's overflowing ones that the candles signified something terrible. Both my parents seemed to retreat into a dark and distant place until the last of the candles flickered out. I couldn't grasp the enormity of their losses, but I imagined that somehow the dead lingered in those shadows. What's a mother to do with the ghosts in the nursery? How does she bind up her own pain enough to pass the family legacy on to the next generation? When the time comes for her to explain to her children that they were named for murdered loved ones, how does she tell that story?
In my house, no morning candles will ever glisten. Too many would have to burn. Millions. Then days of anniversaries would follow. Too many to honor the lost ones. It would take forever. In my house, no morning candles will ever glisten. I tell you, there's not even enough time to light them. My whole life is already a prolonged day of mourning. Each minute is spent in grief. What would I do with little teardrop candles when my heart is like a furnace that burned up my happiness with the other?
Since losing my mother, I have had many occasions to light memorial candles, as is our lot as we grow older. Today, I no longer fear the flickering lights and dancing shadows. Rather, I find them beautiful and comforting. They still hold ghosts, but of people I knew and cherished, who loved and cherished me back. When I light the candles with my family members, we share stories and remembrances. And if I walk by the candles in the night, I greet my beloveds. I tell them how blessed I am to be here to honor their memory and to know that their good names are carried on through the generations after. Thank you. This concludes our formal presentation. We're happy to hear your comments and your questions. Do we have a camera, microphone we can pass around?
Sure.
We can share one mic here.
Either one. And this is a great opportunity for me personally to thank Barbara Walter, who took this project to the library board and membership group to host us for this event. Thank you, Barbara.
So I want to first thank you for such an incredible blending of music and story. It was very moving and wonderful. My question is for Mike. You sat on our deck and you heard the story and you heard some of the readings. You have music in your mind and soul. How did you take that into an opera? What is the process?
Thank you for that question. First of all, the way I work is I lived with the poetry for quite some time, and then from there, reading the other book, the next step was to find a librettist. Joy declined, although she is a gifted writer, but too personal and busy with her career. Her two daughters are authors in their own rights, professors. They too are busy on the tenure chase. So the job of writing the libretto fell in my lap. So that took me about 3.5 years to do the libretto and then mix it with the poems. And from there, just living with the, just went off. From there, living with the material, one just begins to osmosize the deeper meaning of it. I think it's running out of batteries. However,
well, you know, I have a pretty stentorian voice. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so just living with the material, one begins to conjure up the deeper significance of the words, and over time, it evolved. Yes.
So the music just comes.
Pardon me?
The music just comes.
It does. And then the way I work, different composers work in different ways. Most composers that historically seem to write an outline of the harmonic structure. And I've always worked by writing the melodic material first and then discovering the harmony afterwards. And I always felt like, what's wrong with me? I can't really be a composer working. And then a dear friend, William Kraft, who was the timpanist of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, passed away last year. And he's a composer and was composer in residence for the LA Phil for years. And in the memorial service, someone mentioned that the way Bill worked was to write melodic material first and then search for the meaning. So perhaps there's something in the water that percussionists drink that creates that approach to composition. But I felt I was vindicated by this great colleague's working process.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Quick question, when and where will the opera be presented?
Yes, I guess I didn't speak as much as Joy during the interview, so maybe there'll be more composition questions. Well, I don't know. This whole project was done in a hope that it would serve as a calling card to general directors of opera companies to interest them in a full production that's staged with props, lighting, scenery, stage direction, and so on. Whether that'll happen in my lifetime, I do not know. It's an interesting time to be a senior citizen, Caucasian, male composer in our society. I fully support 100, 200, 300,000% the idea of supporting young women, people of color, and gender options, and in having new works commissioned by them, because it was always these old white guys like me, historically, that were given the opportunity to have these commissions. So whether or not this will ever be produced in my lifetime, I don't know. But as a retiree, I just want to compose. And so maybe someday after my lifetime, it will be produced. Hopefully during my lifetime, but one never knows. Thank you for the question.
Thank you both so much. This question is for you, Joy. I think I understood you said you hadn't heard your mother's voice for 39 years until yesterday. Could you speak a little to maybe over the 39 years, if you had a moment you thought you would do it, why you couldn't listen, and how you prepared yourself yesterday? I couldn't listen because every time Doug came up from the basement and said, "So I've got this tape, you want to hear it?" Every cell in my body said no, and it was partly because when I heard it the first time, I heard the kind of stress and anxiety that she carried very severely toward the end of her life. She suffered a fatal heart attack at the book publication party that her best friend threw for her. And it was simply too painful to hear that at the very beginning of the tape, her voice is thin and high and weedy, and she's struggling to find her words, and it pained me so deeply I couldn't face hearing it again. So it was a very pleasant surprise yesterday. I said to Mike and Nancy and to Doug, I'm going to take a deep breath, I'm going to sit down. I do not have to listen to it if it gets to be too much. And I was as mesmerized as I hope you were, because what came out was this vivacious, charming, often very funny woman who delighted in sharing her stories. And she delighted in sharing her stories with me when I was a little girl. Because she kept this promise she made to my brother. She did, in fact, create a legend to secure the immortality of her lost loved ones. And it helped her case in terms of her storytelling mission, that I was a truly terrible eater. And when she couldn't shame me into eating by calling me soup lean and stringy, and when she couldn't convince me by telling me the stories from Poland of a little girl who was so stubbornly skinny that the balloon wafted her high up into a tree, and the fireman had to rescue her, which secretly I thought was a rather romantic notion. But when she said, if you eat your soup all the way to the bottom, I will tell you the story of how your Aunt Dora became a pediatrician, and if you eat your vegetables all up, I will tell you the story of how I played with my grandmother in the park in Warsaw. I took in her stories as great nourishment even in the food. So at first I actually didn't recognize her voice. It seemed odd to me. Hearing it amplified. hearing it amplified today really brought her voice back in a whole new way, and I could not be more grateful. So thank you, Doug, for being stubborn about that.
I just want to say that, because I performed as a bass player there, I'm so grateful. It's beautiful music. Some challenges that I've never faced before in my, how many years have I been playing? Since I was 11. It's a long time, but I and the cellist, we worked very hard. We had a pizzicato section that lasted 2 minutes, which was very, very challenging. I won't go into that. But I just want to say that the whole experience of working with Mike and this opera and the text has been, I have to say, one of the most powerful musical and just human experiences of my life. And for me, I'm retiring, and maybe it's the last performance I have on the stage at Bruce, and I've performed many, many times over my 37 years at CU. But I just want to share that the first rehearsal, we got through everything. We went through the whole opera, and that was on, on Tuesday, huh? And then Wednesday night, we had the next rehearsal, and the whole piece, we played the same music. We played everything on Tuesday, and it sounded so completely different. And the musicians, we were all looking at each other, just sort of in amazement, because it was coming to life. And Mike, I commented to him, he was also kind of amazed at how it was just coming to life. And the singers who were singing were so incredible. And then having Joy come and speak to us before, well, you were there, you came Friday and you spoke with us on Sunday. Or did you talk to us on Friday evening?
No, we didn't even know we were going to be there Friday evening. Doug hot-footed it from Des Moines to Boulder just in the nick of time to arrive.
Yes, and we met in the parking lot. Yeah, anyway, I just want to thank you so much, and the story is incredible. And my heritage is German heritage. My father was an American soldier. My mother's dad left Germany in 1931, 32. People told him, you're not going to survive. And so it's it's very difficult for me to see this and to hear this and it's just such a horrible thing that human beings have done, and the Germans did, and this happening now, and this happened before, and will probably happen again. I didn't plan to say anything other than just thank you, Mike, and thank you, Joy, because this is really, it's incredible, and for you, when you get a chance to hear it live, the sounds and the blending, what you've done, Mike, with these, I think, 8 instruments and the piano, right? Violin, viola, cello, bass, French horn, bass clarinet, oboe, flute, and piano. It's like, it's so scary, really. It's so beautiful. So that's why I told Joy, I said, this is such a horrible thing, but it's also so beautiful, the music, and just such a beautiful remembering of what happened. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for your incredible artistry. I mean, this gentleman is the Paganini of the double bass.
I think it's time to go.
Well, thank you everyone for attending, and can we give it up one more time for unfortunately, I would love it if we could stay and talk all night, but we close at 8 p.m. tonight. So if you'd like to greet our presenters, please do so now.
And I'll also give a shout out to Joy. Her books are available that she read from this evening.